Hi everyone and welcome to the School of Port. Today we are at a very special location, the Factory House. With me here today we have Olga Lacerda. She's the Factory House manager and she's the one who's going to guide us through this amazing building.
The Factory House is the house of the British port wine shippers. It was a house that was built in 1790 and the project was launched by the consul we had here at the time. His name was Mr. John Whitehead. He was consul here for 47 years, which was a long time. As with everything, they had to find a way of financing this. And so the members created a fund called the Contribution Fund, which basically meant that each time one of the members exported, a tax was applied to the value of the shipment. That tax came into the Contribution Fund, and the Contribution Fund built the house, furnished it, looked after Mr. Whitehead, because at the time Mr. Whitehead actually lived here. In those days, there were around 30-odd member houses. As you come round to 2020, now the house belongs to 7. But we are still very active in the sense that we keep our traditions. The Wednesday lunch is something that we keep every week. And also we do many port wine tastings, because this house is very much part of the history of Port, is very much part of the history of our city of Porto. This was a project that we installed about 6 or 7 years ago. We felt that we needed photos of our old treasurers to keep the history going, basically, so that people knew what their ancestors looked like. Because if you consider that this house actually belongs to 7 port wine companies, but actually belongs to 3 families. It's the Symingtons, it's the Robertsons, and it's the Grahams. And so when our members arrive here, they come to this gallery and they can see their father, their grandfather, their uncles. So we felt we should do this. So we put in this project. We started this project. And so now every year we get a new treasurer. In fact, what you will see here, we have our first lady treasurer. So we're in our Factory House cellar. This is our vintage port cellar. We have in all around 14,000 bottles of vintage port. How do we get this vintage? Well, every time we welcome a new member, instead of paying a fee, the member gives the house 12 dozen bottles of vintage port of his choice. We will create a bin to store the vintage port that person has given, and we will put in a label like you will see here. When Paul Symington joined the Factory House, he gave his 12 dozens of Dow's 1977. On the other hand, you will see, for instance, in this case, when Taylor declared that 1980 was a vintage year, they also gave the Factory House 12 dozen bottles. And so we just put in a label in which we have just the name of the house and the year it refers to. You will wonder that 12 dozen bottles don't fit in here. Well, they don't, and you're absolutely right. But it just happens that it's all been drunk already. So we now put it into a smaller bin. And then we also have another situation in which every time one of our member houses declares a vintage, we also receive 12 dozen bottles from each house. So if you consider that on average, every 10 years there are 3 declaration years, and we receive 12 dozen from each house, every 10 years we will receive 7 times 12, 3 times every 10 years. So we have 14,000 bottles of the many, many different years. And when do we serve this? We serve this at every Wednesday lunch, and it's one of the honours that the treasurer of each year has, which is to choose the vintage port he will serve at each Wednesday lunch. He will choose the wine, he will tell me what it is, and clearly we're going to keep this a big secret, because in fact the members are expected to guess not only the house but also the year. And here we are in the reading room. We have a model of our house here. which it would seem coincides with the date of the building of the house. We had a specialist on John Carr buildings out here a few years ago, and he measured our house and he measured the model, and it seems that the scale is 1:16, which coincides with the date of the building of the house. So we can safely say that this was actually the architect's model. Now we also have a newspaper which is called the Daily Universal Register, which was founded in 1785. In 1788 it changed its name, it became the Times. And we have the Times going back to number 1. And one of the many traditions in this house is that every Wednesday lunch we go and fetch the newspaper of that day of 100 years ago, and we put it in the drawing room for the members to read. It's a way of showing our newspaper, and it's very interesting, the kind of information and news that we come across of what happened 100 years before. And this is the main part of our library. We have 20,000 books in here. This used to be a very regular lending library when the community, the port community, was large and the families would come and collect books and take them home to read. Nowadays that's not the case, but we do keep the books that we have. So whenever one of our member houses publishes a new book, we ask them for a copy. Apart from that, what we do is just keep the books in good condition, and we restore X number of books every year just to keep everything in good order. As I explained at the earlier part of the visit, the British came back after the French invasion of Portugal in 1811. And so in 1911, they decided to organize a lunch on the 11th November 1911 at 11 o'clock in the morning for 11 members. As you will see from the photograph above, we have the 11 members. They had 11 courses and 11 wines. And so in 2011, the members decided to repeat the lunch to celebrate the 200 years of their return. We have more than 11 members. We have our full and our retired members, but lunch began at 11. They had 11 courses and 11 wines. And it really was a unique experience and very, very interesting. And so now you're in the ballroom. This room is used for dinners up to 90 guests. We also use it for our Christmas party when the house is full with 200 guests. And as you can imagine, a house this big with 200 guests really looks its best at night. At every Wednesday lunch, the treasurer has his lunch in this room with his guests. When they move into the second dining room, the guests all have to take the same places at the table as they were sitting in this room. And so here we are in the dessert room. This is the room where we serve the vintage port. Now what happens is the members come in, they sit down, and they will have a plate, 2 glasses, one for the tawny port, which we have already started serving in the first dining room with the pudding and the cheese, and the second is for the vintage port, which is already in decanters on the table waiting for the guests. In this case, they don't have to guess the vintage because it's written on the menu, but they sit down, they enjoy the port. This is the original kitchen of the factory house. Obviously, this kitchen hasn't been used for over 100 years. We now have a slightly more modern kitchen on the first floor, but we do keep this as a reminder of what kitchens were like and how hard life was in those days. If you have a look at these cookers, the whole organization of this kitchen, it was very difficult and very hard work, but that's what life was like in those days.
Thank you so much, Olga. This has been incredible, an amazing experience, and we really appreciate the time you took to share all of this information with us. Stay tuned for more videos at School of Port, brought to you by the Port Med people at Symington Family Estates.